Today, we're stepping back into that frozen past to uncover the incredible resilience, quiet courage, and brutal reality of frontier life during the long winter of 1880. If you enjoy calm, immersive history stories like this one, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. I'd love to hear which historical period you want us to explore next. And don't forget to check out the other videos on the channel for more true stories of survival from history. Now, let's travel back to the winter that nearly broke the American frontier. Imagine waking up to a world buried in snow. For months, no heat at the flick of a switch, no grocery store down the road, just howling winds, frozen fields, and a family depending on you to survive. In the winter of 1880, frontier families across the American plains faced what became known as the long winter, one of the coldest, harshest winters in US history. Temperatures plunged, food ran out, and help was hundreds of miles away, and yet, many families endured. So how did they do it? What did they eat when supplies were gone? How did they keep warm when fuel ran low? And what everyday choices meant the difference between life and death? Before the sun comes up, the prairie looks empty in a way that feels intentional, not peaceful, not beautiful, just empty. The land stretches flat in every direction, covered in snow that has been packed hard by months of wind. No trees move, no birds fly. The grass beneath the snow is frozen stiff, bent permanently in one direction, as if it gave up arguing with the weather weeks ago. The wind moves across the plain without obstruction. It does not hurry, it does not pause, it has nowhere else to be. This is how the long winter begins, not with drama, but with quiet confidence. Nature does not announce what it plans to do. It simply starts and keeps going. By the winter of 1880 to 1881, thousands of frontier families are already here. They have houses, or something close to houses. They have children, livestock, tools, hopes, routines. They have survived other winters, and they expect to survive this one too. Most of them believe they are prepared. After all, this is not the first winter they've seen. Snow is familiar, cold is familiar, wind is familiar. Winter, they have been told, is just something to get through before spring arrives again, like always. But this winter is different, and the difference does not show itself all at once. At first, it behaves politely. The early snowfalls arrive in autumn, light and manageable. The ground freezes early, but that is not unheard of. Families pull their coats tighter, patch drafts in their homes, and keep working. Chores still get done. Children still complain about the cold, the same way they complained last year. There is no reason yet to panic. The frontier has trained people to expect hardship. Difficulty is not alarming. Difficulty is normal. The settlers who came here already know how to endure, or at least, they believe they do. And that belief matters, because the long winter does not break people all at once. It erodes them, slowly, quietly, with patience. The snow keeps coming, storm after storm. The wind refuses to stop. The cold deepens, not in dramatic leaps, but by small degrees that add up over time. Nights stretch longer, days feel shorter, and the thaw that everyone expects simply does not arrive. Weeks pass, then months. By January, the idea that spring will come soon begins to feel less certain. By February, people stop saying it out loud. By March, hope is handled carefully, like something fragile that might shatter if spoken too strongly. This winter will become known as the long winter, not because of a single storm or a single tragedy, but because it refuses to end. Temperatures drop far below what settlers have experienced before. Cold becomes something physical, something with weight. It presses into the body. It burns the lungs. It freezes breath in the air and turns eyelashes white. Frostbite no longer feels rare. It feels inevitable. Inside frontier homes, many of them made of sod, dirt, or thin wood, the cold moves freely. Fires burn constantly, yet rooms remain icy. Ice forms on walls. Blankets stiffen overnight. Children wake with frost on their bedding and accept it without comment. There is no pause button on winter. What makes the long winter especially cruel is not just its severity, but the confidence people had before it arrived. The late 1800s are a time of progress, or at least the appearance of it. Railroads cut across the plains. Towns sprang up almost overnight. Newspapers talk about expansion, growth, and opportunity. Government officials speak with certainty about settlement and success. Pamphlets promise fertile land and manageable weather. Railroad companies describe mild winters and endless harvests. The message is clear. The frontier is hard, but it is knowable. It can be planned for. conquered, even. Most families who settled here did so with faith in those promises. They believed that if they worked hard enough, prepared carefully enough, and endured patiently enough, the land would eventually reward them. And in fairness, many of them did prepare. They stored food, they built shelters, they gathered fuel. They did what they were told sensible people do. What they could not prepare for was a winter that ignored every rule they thought they understood. The long winter does not care about optimism. It does not care about government assurances. It does not care how far someone traveled to get here, or what they sold to do it. Nature, in this moment, is not cruel. Cruelty implies intention. Nature is indifferent. It does not wake up one morning and decide to test the frontier families. It simply continues being cold, continues snowing, continues blowing wind across the plains until roads disappear, rail lines vanish, and the horizon itself feels erased. And slowly, the line between survival and catastrophe begins to thin. At first, families adapt. They tighten rations. They burn a little more fuel. They reassure one another that the weather will break soon. There is still humor, even now. Someone will joke that winter is taking its time this year, or that the snow must be lost. Laughter is useful. It warms the room, if only briefly. But as days pass and storms stack on top of storms, routines begin to strain. Supplies shrink. Fuel piles grow smaller. The distance between what families have and what they need grows wider, and the snow keeps falling. Outside, the prairie remains quiet, too quiet. Sound does not carry well in the cold. Footsteps vanish quickly. Tracks disappear overnight. Familiar landmarks blur into white shapes that all look the same. The land that once felt open and full of possibility now feels vast in a different way. Vast and empty. Vast and uncaring. By the time the long winter tightens its grip fully, it is already too late to escape it. Trains will stop running. Roads will vanish. Help will not come, because help cannot reach them. What remains are families, scattered across the plains, facing a season that refuses to behave. They will endure hunger, cold, sickness, isolation, and loss. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, day by day, decision by decision. And the hardest part is this: most of them will survive. Not triumphantly, not heroically, just quietly. The long winter does not end lives in a single moment. It reshapes them. It leaves marks that do not show on maps or monuments. Marks that settle into memory, into bones, into the way stories are told years later. This is not a story about conquest or victory. It is a story about people who believed they were ready and learned, slowly and painfully, what ready actually means. And it all begins here, on a silent prairie, before the sun rises, with snow that shows no sign of stopping, before the winter ever arrived, before the snow-buried fences and erased roads. There was a decision, and that decision was not made in the cold. It was made in warm kitchens back east, in rented rooms, in crowded towns where land was scarce and opportunity felt smaller every year. It was made over newspaper ads, railroad pamphlets, and conversations that always ended the same way. We could have our own land. That idea mattered more than almost anything else. By the late 1800s, land in the eastern United States was expensive and increasingly out of reach. Farms were divided again and again between children until there was barely enough soil left to support a family. Wages in cities were low, work was unstable, and ownership the kind that meant something felt reserved for someone else. The frontier offered an answer, or at least it looked like one. The Homestead Act promised 160 acres to anyone willing to live on and improve the land. For many families, that number felt unreal. 160 acres sounded endless, enough space to breathe, enough room to build something permanent. The government wanted settlers. Railroads wanted passengers. Towns wanted growth. And together, they told a story that was very easy to believe. Pamphlets showed tall crops and clear skies. Illustrations featured neat houses and smiling families. The land was described as fertile. The weather was described as manageable. Winters, they said, were cold but brief. Nothing a hard-working family couldn't handle. And so people listened. They sold furniture, livestock, family heirlooms. Some sold everything they owned except what they could load into a wagon or carry onto a train. This was not reckless optimism. It was calculated hope. Many of these families had already endured hardship. They were not fragile people. They knew hunger. They knew illness. They knew loss. What they lacked was land that belonged to them. The frontier promised that. Railroad companies were especially persuasive. Every mile of track needed settlers to justify its existence. Towns sprang up along the rails almost overnight. Stations became communities. Communities became counties. On paper, it all looked orderly and inevitable. What the pamphlets did not emphasize was how new all of this was. There was no long history here, no proven rhythm, no generational knowledge passed down about how this land behaved in its worst moments. Most settlers were learning as they went, building lives on ground that had not yet revealed its rules. And still, they came. Families arrived in waves, some from the eastern states, others from Europe, carrying traditions shaped by entirely different climates. Scandinavians, Germans, Irish, many familiar with cold, but not this kind of open, relentless exposure. The prairie had no forests to break the wind, no hills to hide behind, no natural shelter. It was wide and flat and honest in a way that could be misleading. On a calm summer day, it felt forgiving. On a clear autumn morning, it felt manageable. And that is when most families arrived. They staked claims, marked boundaries, dug foundations, built homes quickly, because speed mattered more than comfort. A roof before winter was better than a perfect house too late. The goal was simple: survive the first year. After that, things would get easier. Everyone said so, and for a while, it seemed true. Crops grew, livestock grazed, towns buzzed with cautious optimism. Churches were built, schools opened, newspapers printed schedules and announcements and stories about progress. Winter, when it came, was expected to be just another challenge, something to endure, not something to fear. Most settlers had been told that the harsh winters of the past were exaggerations, that earlier reports were overblown, that modern railroads and expanding towns had tamed the frontier. Progress had a way of making people feel protected. The truth was, many families arrived with just enough supplies to get by, not because they were careless, but because carrying more was expensive and difficult. Every pound mattered. Every item had to justify its place in a wagon or rail car. There was no room for excess. The plan was to rely on trains for resupply, on neighbors for help, on the idea that no winter could last forever. This was not foolishness. It was the logic of the time. People trusted systems that had not yet been tested under extreme conditions. They trusted that rail lines would stay open, that coal shipments would arrive, that mail would bring news and reassurance, that help, if needed, would not be too far away. They did not imagine a winter long enough to cut them off entirely. And why would they? In most places, winter came and went. It arrived loudly, stayed briefly, and left behind stories people laughed about in spring. It was something to complain about, not something to fear. The frontier did not advertise its worst seasons. What families could not see, what no pamphlet showed, was how thin the margin truly was, how close many households already were to the edge, how dependent survival would become on systems that required cooperation from the weather itself. They believed in effort, in routine, in patience, in the idea that nature, while difficult, could be worked with. And most of the time, that belief served them well. But belief does not warm a house. It does not feed children. It does not stop snow from falling. By the time the long winter arrived, these families were already committed. There was no easy way back, no savings to retreat, or no quick escape route. They had chosen the frontier not because it was easy, but because it promised something better than what they left behind. What they could not know was that this winter would test not just their endurance, but the very idea that preparation alone was enough. The decision to come west was not a mistake, but it came with a cost no one had calculated correctly. And as the snow began to fall soft at first, almost politely the dream of land and independence remained intact. For now, the prairie still looked open, the houses still stood, the future still felt possible. Winter had not yet shown what it was capable of, and the families who came west, chasing land and certainty, had no idea they were about to learn how fragile both could be. Before winter arrived, life on the frontier was already a careful balancing act. Nothing here was excessive, nothing was wasted. Every task, every tool, every hour of daylight had a purpose. Families did not live comfortably, they lived efficiently, and efficiency left very little room for error. Most frontier homes were built quickly, because they had to be. When a family claimed land, the first priority was shelter. Not a good house, just a house, something with walls, something with a roof, something that could be finished before the weather changed. On the open prairie, trees were rare. Timber had to be hauled long distances or purchased at great cost. So many families built with what they had under their feet. Sod houses, blocks of thick prairie grass and dirt were cut from the ground and stacked like bricks. The roots held them together. The soil provided weight. When done well, sod walls could be surprisingly sturdy. They were also cold, damp, and never fully sealed. Rain leaked through. Wind found gaps. Insects moved in without asking. In summer, the houses stayed cool. In winter, they became refrigerators with doors. Families who could afford lumber built small cabins instead. These were better, but still far from solid. Boards shrank in the cold. Cracks opened. Chinking fell loose. The wind did not need an invitation. Most homes had one main room, sometimes two, if the family was lucky. Cooking, eating, sleeping, and working all happened in the same space. Privacy was not expected. Warmth was. Furniture was minimal. A table, a few chairs, beds built into walls or corners. Storage was whatever space could be found between rafters and beams. Every item had to earn its place. Water came from shallow wells, often dug by hand. In warmer months, this was manageable. In winter, it became work. Ice formed quickly. Buckets froze. Ropes stiffened. Drawing water took time and strength that was already in short supply. Livestock were few because feed was expensive and land had to be cleared. A cow or two, if possible. Maybe a pig. Chickens, if they survived predators and weather. Horses were valuable but hard to keep fed. Animals were not pets. They were survival tools. Milk meant nutrition. Horses meant transport. Chickens meant eggs. Losing livestock meant losing options. Crops were everything. Most families depended on a single harvest to carry them through the year. Wheat, corn or oats, whatever grew best on their claim. The yield determined how much food could be stored, traded or sold. A bad harvest meant a hard year. A good harvest meant survival with little margin. By autumn, families worked constantly. Crops had to be gathered. Food had to be preserved. Fuel had to be collected. Repairs had to be made before cold set in. There was always more to do than time allowed. Firewood was gathered wherever possible. Fence lines were checked. Roofs were patched. Cracks were stuffed with rags, grass, or mud. Anything to slow the wind. No one expected perfection. They expected good enough, and in most years, good enough was enough. Supplies going into winter were modest. Flour, salt pork, beans, dried vegetables, some preserved fruit, if the summer had been kind. Seed grain was stored carefully, meant for spring planting, not eating. Fuel was counted. Coal, if it could be afforded. Wood, if it could be found. Dung, dried and stacked, though few liked to talk about that part. The assumption was simple. Winter would be cold, but it would not be endless. The goal was to last until the thaw. Neighbors depended on one another, but everyone was busy building their own lives. Communities were young. Relationships were polite but practical. Help was offered when possible, but no one had much to spare. There was a quiet confidence in routine. People rose early, worked until dark, ate simple meals, slept deeply from exhaustion. This rhythm made life feel stable, even when it wasn't. Children were expected to help. They hauled water, gathered fuel, fed animals. Childhood on the frontier was not delicate. It was useful. Still, there were small comforts. A warm stove on a cold morning, a meal shared quietly, a hymn sung in the evening, laughter when something went wrong but not disastrously wrong. These moments mattered. They made the work feel worthwhile. By late fall, most families felt ready, not confident, exactly, but prepared enough. They had done what they could with what they had. The houses stood, the food was stored, the fuel was stacked. Winter could come. What they did not realize was how tightly their survival depended on timing. They had planned for cold. They had planned for snow. They had not planned for months of unrelenting weather. They had not planned for trains to stop, for supplies to vanish, for isolation to stretch longer than anyone thought possible. Every decision made before winter assumed one thing, that winter would eventually loosen its grip. That assumption shaped everything. Homes were built to endure cold, not siege. Supplies were gathered to last a season, not an ordeal. Fuel was counted in weeks, not months. No one planned for a winter that refused to follow rules. As the first snows began to fall, families looked at their homes with a sense of cautious pride. They had carved something out of nothing. They had survived their first year. They were no longer newcomers. The prairie still felt wide and open. The future still felt negotiable. The cold had not yet revealed how thoroughly it could invade every part of life. And so, When winter arrived quietly, without warning or drama, no one panicked. Why would they? They had done everything right. They just didn't know yet that right would not be enough. The first snow does not scare anyone. It never does. It arrives lightly, almost politely, dusting the prairie instead of covering it. The ground turns white, then brown again as the sun peeks through. Boots crunch, breath shows in the air. Someone jokes that winter has finally remembered where it left the plains. Life goes on. Chores still need doing. Animals still need feeding. Water still needs hauling. Snow, at this stage, is just another inconvenience. It slows things down, but not enough to change plans. People had seen this before. In October, the cold comes and goes. One day sharp and biting, the next mild enough to work without gloves. Snow melts during the afternoon. Mud replaces it. Wagons still move. Trains still run. Nothing feels urgent yet. Families keep their routines. Children still play outside, though for shorter stretches. Women hang laundry indoors instead of out. Men add an extra log to the fire before bed. These are small adjustments. Familiar ones. Neighbors talk over fences and doorways. They compare notes. Colder than last year, someone says. About the same. Another replies. Everyone has an opinion, and none of them suggest danger. Winter, at this point, feels predictable. By November, snowfalls become more frequent. Storms last longer. Wind sharpens. The ground freezes hard and does not thaw again between storms. Still, no one panics. Normal winters begin this way too. People trust their experience. They trust memory. They trust that what happened before will happen again. This is called normalcy, though no one uses that word. It's just how people think. The mind looks for patterns. The past becomes a guide. And the past says, winter comes, winter goes. Families finish their last outdoor tasks. Tools are put away. Wagons are parked. Animals are brought closer to shelter. Doors are sealed as best they can be. There is a sense of settling in. Evenings grow longer. Lamps are lit earlier. Meals stretch a little slower. Conversation fills the time once used for work. There is comfort in being inside while snow falls outside. Snow, when watched from a window, can even feel peaceful. By late November, the storms start to stack up. Snow does not melt anymore. It stays where it falls, pressed flatter by wind and cold. Drifts form along fences and buildings. Paths are shoveled, then shoveled again. Still, this does not feel alarming. Families have endured storms before. They know how to wait them out. A few days indoors is manageable. A week, even, if necessary. Neighbors reassure one another. They share news when they meet in town or church. The talk is casual. Winter's starting early this year. Hope it doesn't keep it up. It'll break soon enough. There is comfort in shared belief. People continue to assume that weather has limits, that it gets tired, that it moves on. By December, the cold deepens. The snow hardens. Wind scours the land and fills in paths almost as soon as they are cleared. Travel becomes slower, but not impossible. At least, not yet. Children still attend school when they can. Adults still make trips to town for supplies. Trains still arrive, though sometimes late. Life feels constrained, but not threatened. The idea that something is wrong has not fully formed. There is no clear moment when people say, this is different. Instead, there is a gradual shift in tone. Jokes become shorter. Complaints last longer. Silences stretch. People begin to notice how often it is cold, how rarely the wind stops, how the snow never seems to soften. But noticing is not the same as understanding. The human mind resists the idea that a situation can continue indefinitely. There is comfort in assuming an end point. Winter has always ended before. Why would this one be any different? Families still believe they are early in the season. They still think in terms of weeks, not months. They count supplies with mild concern, not fear. Food looks adequate. Fuel stacks still exist. There is no reason yet to ration heavily. Some families even feel confident, proud, almost. They are managing. They are proving they belong here. The prairie, however, has begun to close in. Snow smooths the landscape until landmarks blur. Fence posts disappear under drifts. Roads become suggestions rather than directions. The horizon loses detail, becoming a pale line between white ground and white sky. Orientation becomes harder. Still, people adjust. They mark paths. They memorize routes. They help one another when needed. This is what frontier life is about. After all, endurance. But winter is quietly changing its behavior. Storms come closer together. There is less time between them. The wind grows stronger, sharper, more persistent. Nights feel colder than they should. By mid-December, temperatures drop lower than expected. Not dangerously low, just lower. Enough to make people pause, enough to make fires burn faster, enough to make the cold linger in bones longer than usual. Still, no one imagines the worst. They assume the weather is misbehaving briefly, that it will correct itself. That assumption keeps people calm. It also keeps them from changing course. Families continue using fuel at a normal pace. They continue eating regular meals. They continue expecting trains to arrive, mail to come, and roads to clear. Why wouldn't they? Nothing dramatic has happened yet. No single storm announces the long winter. There is no moment when the sky darkens and a voice says, "This is the one." Instead, winter creeps forward like a tide that never pulls back. Each snowfall seems manageable on its own. Each cold snap feels temporary. Each delay feels minor. Together, they add up to something far larger than anyone intended to face. By the time people begin to sense that winter is overstaying its welcome, they are already deep inside it. And still, they reassure themselves. It will end soon. It always does. The frontier has taught them to be tough, not suspicious. So they wait. They shovel. They tend fires. They bundle children in layers. They trust routine, because routine has always worked before. They do not yet know that the long winter has no intention of following the rules. And while snow continues to fall softly outside their windows, the moment for easy choices quietly passes. Winter has settled in, and it is not planning to leave. At first, the trains are only late, a few hours behind schedule, then half a day, then a full day. Conductors apologize. Station agents shrugged. Snow slows things down, they say. Nothing to worry about. Trains have always been reliable. Steel tracks feel permanent, solid, more dependable than wagons or horses ever were. For frontier towns, the railroad is not just transportation, it is connection. Food comes by rail, coal comes by rail, mail comes by rail. So when trains begin to hesitate, people notice. But hesitation is not failure. Not yet. Station platforms filled with people waiting longer than usual. Boots stamp against the cold. Breath hangs in the air. Someone cracks a joke about winter testing the schedule. The joke lands. Everyone laughs, because trains do not simply stop. They are part of progress. And progress, people believe, moves forward no matter the weather. Then one morning, the train does not arrive at all. No whistle in the distance. No vibration in the ground. No plume of smoke breaking the white horizon. At first, this feels temporary. A single missed arrival, a drift too deep, a delay somewhere down the line. People tell themselves it will come tomorrow. But tomorrow arrives without a train. Snow has piled higher along the tracks than anyone remembers seeing. Drifts harden into walls, switches freeze, engines struggle. Crews fight the cold until fighting it no longer works. Rail lines vanish under white. Coal shipments stop first. This matters more than most people realize at the beginning. Coal is heat. Heat is survival. Without coal, families rely on wood, dried corn, cobs, or anything else that burns. Coal piles begin shrinking immediately. Stores stop selling it freely, not out of greed, but necessity. They ration. They hold back stock for emergencies. They wait for the next shipment that everyone still believes is coming. Mail service becomes irregular, then silent. Letters do not arrive. Newspapers stop appearing. Information dries up almost overnight. Without mail, rumors take over. Someone says trains are stuck just a few towns over. Someone else says the whole line is buried. No one knows for sure, and not knowing is worse than bad news. By January, it becomes clear that the trains are not coming back anytime soon. Snowplows have tried. Crews have tried. Nature has refused to cooperate. The cold is too severe. The drifts too deep. The wind too relentless. Railroads, for all their power, are still exposed to the open plains, and the plains are winning. Frontier towns begin to feel smaller. Stores empty faster than expected. Shelves that once held flour, sugar, coffee, and kerosene now look thin. Prices rise quietly, not sharply, but enough to make people pause before buying. Some items vanish entirely. Coal, fresh food, replacement parts. What remains is what was already here. Families who had counted on resupply realized their calculations were wrong. What was meant to last until spring must now stretch much longer. Isolation settles in slowly. Roads disappear under snow. Wagons cannot pass, horses struggle, traveling even short distances becomes dangerous. Getting lost within sight of town is no longer unthinkable. Communities that once felt connected now feel cut off. The idea of outside help fades. There is no outside anymore, only what is already here. Church bells ring less often, gatherings shrink, people stay home more. Not out of fear, exactly, but out of conservation. Energy must be saved, fuel must be saved. Every trip outdoors costs something. By February, the reality becomes impossible to ignore. The trains are not delayed, they are defeated. Coal shortages turn serious. Families who never imagined running out now count every shovelful. Fires burn lower, rooms grow colder, nights stretch longer. Some towns organize shared heating spaces. Churches and schools open their doors. People bring what fuel they can spare and huddle together. Others stay home and hope. Mail carriers stop trying altogether. There is nothing to carry and nowhere to go. The silence grows heavy. Without newspapers, people lose their sense of the wider world. They do not know how bad the winter is elsewhere. They do not know if help is being planned. They do not know if anyone remembers them. This uncertainty eats away at morale. Isolation does something strange to time. Days blur together. Without regular deliveries or schedules, the calendar loses meaning. People stop marking dates. They count in storms instead. The collapse of supply chains exposes how thin the frontier really is, how much daily life depends on movement, how little stands between comfort and crisis. What had felt like independence now feels like exposure. Families who once took pride in self-sufficiency realize how much they relied on the railroad without thinking about it. The train was always there, until it wasn't, and there is a quiet shame in that realization. No one says it out loud, but many think the same thing. We did not plan for this, not because they were careless, but because the idea itself felt unreasonable. Who plans for a winter long enough to shut down the railroads entirely? Nature, it turns out, does not need permission to do unreasonable things. As weeks pass without trains, towns change. Stores become gathering places not for shopping, but for information. People trade rumors like currency. Someone heard that a relief train might be coming. Someone else heard it turned back. Hope arrives in small bursts, then fades. And with each passing week, the reality settles deeper. They are on their own. The prairie feels larger now. Not open, but isolating. The same space that once promised opportunity now amplifies distance. Families look at their supplies differently. Coal piles are measured. Food is counted. Fuel is guarded. Conversations turn practical. How long can we make this last? What can we spare? What can we burn? The train tracks, buried and silent, become a symbol of something uncomfortable. Progress has limits. Steel bends. Schedules break. Systems fail. And when they do, the frontier offers no backup plan. The long winter has crossed the threshold. It is no longer just cold. It is no longer just snow. It is isolation. And from this point forward, survival depends not on what can be brought in, but on what people already have owned, how carefully they use it. The trains are gone, and with them, the illusion that the frontier is ever truly connected to anything beyond itself. Cold is something people think they understand. Most frontier families had lived through winter before. They knew frozen fingers and stiff joints. They knew how breath looked in the air and how metal burned the skin when touched too long. They thought they knew cold. The long winter taught them otherwise. This cold did not arrive all at once. It deepened slowly, day by day, as if testing how much the body could tolerate before breaking. Temperatures fell lower than anyone expected, then stayed there. Not for hours, not for days, but for weeks. On some mornings, the thermometer dropped past 40 degrees. On others, there was no need to check. The air itself made the point. Breathing hurt. Each inhale felt sharp, like drawing air through cloth soaked in ice. Nostrils stuck together. Lungs protested. A short walk outside left the chest aching, as if it had been scraped from the inside. Exposed skin went numb almost immediately. Fingers lost feeling in minutes. Ears burned, then faded into dull pressure. Frostbite stopped being a rare accident and became a constant threat. People learned to move carefully. Too fast, and sweat formed, then froze. Too slow, and the cold crept in deeper. Even simple tasks turned dangerous. Hauling water, feeding animals, shoveling a path. A mistake could cost a finger, a toe, or worse. Inside homes, the cold did not stop at the door. Fires burned constantly, but the heat struggled to spread. Rooms stayed cold enough that breath still showed indoors. Water froze in buckets. Ice formed along walls and ceilings. At night, families piled blankets together. Coats stayed on. Children slept in hats and mittens. Parents tucked them in again and again, checking fingers and faces by lamplight. Still, the cold crept in. Blankets grew stiff by morning. Sheets crackled when moved. Ice gathered on the inside of windows, thick enough to scrape with a knife. Some families woke to find their hair frozen to pillows. This kind of cold did not fade with sleep. It lingered. It settled into bones. It made joints ache constantly. Old injuries flared. Arthritis became a daily companion. The body burned more energy just staying warm. Hunger grew sharper. Fatigue deepened. Cold became an active presence. It shaped every decision. People planned movements carefully. Trips outside were shortened or postponed. Tasks were combined to reduce exposure. Children were kept indoors as much as possible. Even then, accidents happened. A glove dropped in the snow became dangerous to retrieve. A bootlace frozen stiff delayed someone too long outside. A stumble into a drift could mean struggling to stand before numbness took hold. Cold did not forgive distraction. It also changed how people thought. Time slowed. The effort required for everything increased. The cold demanded attention constantly. It was impossible to forget it for long. People spoke less, not because they had nothing to say, but because talking required opening the mouth to the air. Conversations shortened. Silence filled the gaps. Humor survived, but quietly. Someone would joke that winter had settled in for good, or that the cold was trying to kill us politely. Laughter came, then faded quickly as breath fogged and froze. Children adapted in their own way. They learned to recognize the early sting of frostbite. They learned to keep moving without sweating. They learned that crying outside made things worse. Many accepted the cold without complaint, because complaining did not change it. At night, children woke often. Not always from hunger, sometimes just from the cold pressing in. Parents rose again and again to feed the fire, add blankets, rub hands together. Sleep became lighter, shorter, never fully restful. The cold also carried sound strangely. Wind howled endlessly across the plains, slipping through cracks and seams. Houses groaned. Boards popped and shifted. Roofs creaked under snow and ice. These sounds became constant companions. Some nights, the wind was so strong it felt like the house itself was breathing, inhaling cold, exhaling drafts. People learned to listen for changes. A sudden quiet after a storm could feel unsettling. Silence meant the cold had settled deeper. Outside, the world grew brittle. Trees snapped under ice. Fence posts split. Tools left outdoors shattered when handled. Metal became dangerous to touch without protection. Animals suffered too. Livestock huddled against whatever shelter they had. Breath froze in their nostrils. Milk production dropped. Some animals simply lay down and did not rise again. Watching this was hard. Each loss made the cold feel personal. People began to talk about temperature in new ways, not in numbers, but in effects. Cold enough to freeze water solid near the stove. Cold enough to crack wood. Cold enough to make ink useless. Numbers stopped mattering. What mattered was endurance. And the most frightening part was not how cold it was, but how long it stayed that way. There were no breaks, no thaws, no soft days to catch up on rest or repairs. The cold pressed on relentlessly, wearing people down. It tested patience. It tested judgment. It tested hope. Some families began to fear falling asleep too deeply. Fires had to be tended. If a fire died overnight, restarting it in the morning cold could be impossible. Parents slept in shifts, one eye open, one ear listening for the sound of fire fading. The cold also changed the meaning of comfort. Warmth became precious. A brief moment near the stove felt luxurious. Hands thawed slowly, painfully. Feeling returned in waves, sharp and burning. People lingered near heat longer than they should, knowing they would soon have to step back into the cold. And still, they endured. Not because they were heroic, not because they had a choice. They endured because the alternative was unthinkable. The long winter's cold was not just a condition, it was an opponent. One that never slept, never tired, and never negotiated. It did not care about preparation or effort. It did not respond to optimism. It simply existed. And every day it stayed. It demanded something in returns. Energy, fuel, hope. By the time people realized they were experiencing something beyond memory, beyond comparison, it was already too late to escape it. The cold had settled in for the long stay. and it was only getting started. A frontier home was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to be enough to block the wind, enough to hold a fire, enough to sleep inside and wake up alive. During the long winter, many families learned how thin that promise really was. Sod houses, for all their strength, had weaknesses that only extreme cold could reveal. The dirt walls held moisture. When temperatures dropped, that moisture froze. Ice crept through the walls slowly, turning them hard and cold to the touch. The wind found its way inside anyway. It slipped through gaps where sod blocks had shrunk. It pushed through seams where the earth had settled. It whispered through corners and then began to howl. Families stuffed cracks with whatever they could find. Old cloth, rags, grass, paper, even dried weeds. It helped, a little, never enough. Wooden cabins were not much better. Boards warped and pulled apart as the cold deepened. Nails loosened. Chinking fell away in brittle chunks. Every gap became a small doorway for the wind. People learned exactly where drafts lived. They avoided certain spots. They rearranged beds. They moved tables and chairs to block the worst of it. Sometimes they simply accepted that one corner of the room would never be warm. Ice formed inside homes, as if the outside world had decided to move in. Windows frosted over completely. Walls glittered faintly in lamplight. Water spilled on the floor froze before it could be wiped up. Pots left too far from the fire turned solid overnight. Breath hung in the air, even indoors. Families slept fully dressed. Coats stayed on. Boots were placed close to the stove, so they would not freeze solid by morning. Gloves were tucked under pillows to keep them flexible. Blankets were layered thick, but they only helped so much. The cold pressed down from above and crept up from below. Beds near the floor were the worst. Cold settled low, pooling like water. Children often slept higher, if possible, sharing beds, piling together for warmth. Privacy disappeared completely. There was no space to be alone, no room for quiet. Everyone existed in the same few feet of space, all day and all night. Normally, this closeness could feel comforting. During the long winter, it became exhausting. There was nowhere to escape the cold, and nowhere to escape each other. Fires burned constantly. Stoves glowed red. Iron popped and cracked as it expanded and contracted. Ash had to be cleared again and again. Someone was always tending the fire. Even at night, letting it die was not an option. But even with constant fire, warmth was uneven. The side of the room near the stove could feel almost comfortable. A few steps away, the cold returned immediately. People learned to rotate positions. Sit near the fire for a while, warm hands and feet, then move aside so someone else could take that place. This quiet rotation became part of daily life. Cooking was harder too. Water froze before it boiled. Bread dough refused to rise. Grease thickened. Meals took longer and produced less heat than hoped. Still, people cooked. They ate warm food whenever they could. It mattered more than taste. Smoke became another problem. Chimneys clogged with ice. Drafts failed. Smoke backed up into rooms, stinging eyes and lungs. People cracked doors briefly to clear the air, then slammed them shut before the cold rushed in. Every adjustment came with a cost. Floors were cold enough to numb feet within seconds. Rugs helped a little. Straw helped more. Some families spread hay across the floor just to create a barrier. It looked messy. No one cared. Ceilings leaked when ice melted slightly during brief warm moments, then froze again. Drips fell steadily into buckets. In some sod houses, dirt sifted down from above as the roof shifted. People swept and patched constantly. Maintenance never stopped. Children adapted quickly. They learned which spots were safest. They learned not to touch metal. They learned to stay close to warmth without getting too close. Burns were a real risk too. Parents worried constantly about frostbite, about fire, about smoke, about collapse. Sleep was light and broken. Every sound mattered. A change in the wind, a shift in the fire, a crack from the roof. Parents woke at the smallest noise, hearts already racing. Night felt longer inside these fragile homes. Darkness came early. Lamps burned low to conserve oil. Shadows moved strangely across icy walls. Wind pressed against the structure with a steady force that felt personal. Some nights, people lay awake listening, wondering if the house could withstand one more storm. The homes creaked and groaned under pressure. They were not failing, exactly, but they were not strong either. They existed in a constant state of holding on, and yet people still tried to keep life normal. Beds were made in the morning, even if they froze stiff by afternoon. Meals were served at regular times. Children were scolded for small things. Lessons were recited when possible. Routine was a kind of insulation. It gave shape to days that might otherwise blur into cold and darkness. Still, there was no true refuge. No room in the house where the cold could not reach. No moment when people forgot it entirely. Even by the fire, even under blankets, the cold waited. It pressed against walls. It slipped through floors. It hovered just beyond the reach of warmth. People began to think of their homes differently, not as protection, but as negotiation. The house did not keep the cold out. It slowed it, that was all. And slowing it was sometimes enough, but it required constant effort. When storms raged outside, families gathered close and waited. Snow piled against walls, sometimes covering windows entirely. Light faded. The house felt smaller. Some families dug tunnels just to reach doors. When storms passed, damage was assessed. New cracks, new leaks, new problems to solve. This endless maintenance wore people down. There was no rest, no sense of safety, only vigilance. And yet, these homes, flawed, cold, fragile, were all that stood between families and the full force of the prairie. Leaving them was not an option. So people stayed inside, tended fires, stuffed cracks, and waited. They waited for warmer days. They waited for the wind to stop. They waited for winter to loosen its grip. The houses did their best. So did the people inside them. But as the long winter continued, it became clear that shelter alone would not be enough. Because even the strongest home cannot survive without warmth. And warmth, slowly and quietly, was becoming harder to hold on to. Cold could be endured. Hunger could be endured. But without fuel, neither of those things mattered for long. At first, fuel was just another item to manage. Coal piles sat outside homes or behind stores, dark against the snow. Firewood stacks leaned against walls. Corn cobs were saved in sacks. Dried dung, stacked carefully, waited its turn. There was no panic yet. Fuel was meant to last the season. Fires were built in the morning, tended through the day, and banked carefully at night. People had done this before. The routine felt familiar, but winter kept stretching, and fuel did not. Coal disappeared faster than expected, not because people were careless, but because the cold demanded more than anyone had planned for. Fires burned hotter and longer. Stoves stayed lit around the clock. What once lasted a week now lasted days. When coal ran low, families turned to wood. Fence posts came down first. Not all at once, just one here, one there. Enough to keep the fire going. Fences could be rebuilt later. Winter could not be negotiated with. Wood ran out. There were no forests to fall back on. The prairie offered very little that burned well. People scavenged. They searched creek beds for driftwood. They broke apart sheds. They pulled up floorboards in unused spaces. Nothing was sacred once it could burn. Corn cobs became fuel. They burned quickly, poorly, but they burned. Dried weeds went into the fire. So did twisted roots pulled from frozen ground. Dung was gathered and dried carefully. It was not discussed much, but it was used often. It burned slowly and smelled unpleasant, but it produced heat. Heat was all that mattered. Furniture began to disappear. A chair leg here, a table plank there. Old shelves, broken tools, anything wooden that was no longer absolutely necessary. Books were harder. Some families burned newspapers first, old letters, school papers. Then, when those were gone, books followed. This was not done lightly. Books represented education, memory, connection to another life. Burning them felt wrong. But cold did not respect sentiment. One family burned a family Bible, page by page, because it was the thickest book they owned. They did not talk about it afterward. Fuel shortages changed behavior quietly. People stopped heating entire rooms. They closed off spaces and crowded into one area. Cooking fires doubled as heating fires. Meals were timed around warmth. Night became dangerous. Without enough fuel, fires were banked lower. Some nights, they went out entirely. Restarting a fire in the morning cold was slow and painful. Fingers stiffened. Matches failed. Breath fogged and froze. Some families slept in shifts to keep the fire alive. Others gambled and hoped. Every evening came with the same calculation. How much can we burn tonight and still have something left for tomorrow? That question followed people constantly. Stores stopped selling fuel altogether. What little coal remained was reserved for emergencies, though no one could agree what qualified as one. Churches and schools pooled fuel when they could. Communal fires were built. People gathered, not for comfort, but for survival. Still, not everyone could leave their homes. Fuel became a quiet panic. There were no riots, no shouting, no dramatic moments, just a steady tightening of choices. People burned things they never imagined burning. Things meant to last years. Things meant to be handed down. The house grew emptier as the fire grew brighter. Children noticed. They asked where the chair went, why the table was smaller, why the bookshelf was gone. Adults answered vaguely. We didn't need it anymore. This was true. In a way, every burned object bought time. Time for another day. Time for another night. The fear was not sudden freezing. It was gradual exposure. A room growing colder day by day. Nights lasting longer. Bodies losing strength. Fuel was the barrier between life and the prairie. Without it, homes became shells. Wind pressed in harder. Ice formed faster. Cold settled deeper. People learned to move less. Activity burned calories and demanded warmth. Sitting still conserved both, though it invited stiffness and pain. The house grew quieter. Laughter faded. Conversation shortened. People spoke only when necessary, saving breath, saving energy. When storms raged, fuel was spent faster. Fires roared. Stoves glowed. People fed them constantly, knowing each log shortened the future. The sound of wood cracking in the fire became strangely comforting. It meant warmth, even if brief. Then it meant loss. By late winter, some families had nothing left to burn but structural parts of their homes. Door frames, bed slats, roof supports. These choices were not made all at once. One piece, then another, enough to keep the fire alive. Each burn weakened the house. Each burn made the next storm more dangerous. But there was no alternative. Cold did not accept excuses. People became experts at reading fires, at judging heat, at coaxing flames from the smallest scraps, at stretching embers through the night. Fuel management became a skill as important as farming ever was. Still, some ran out. When that happened, neighbors sometimes helped. A bucket of coal, a bundle of cobs, a few pieces of wood. Sharing fuel meant sharing risk. Not everyone could afford to be generous. These decisions weighed heavily. Helping one family could doom another. Doing nothing felt equally wrong. There was no right answer. The quiet panic did not scream. It whispered. It showed itself in careful movements, in guarded glances at the fire, in the way people lingered too long near warmth. It showed itself in dreams of spring, of sun, of days without counting logs. Fuel was never just fuel again. It became time. It became safety. It became the thin line holding winter at bay. And as supplies dwindled, people understood something deeply unsettling. Cold could be endured. Hunger could be endured. But without fire, the long winter would win very quickly. So they fed the flames with whatever they had left, and hoped it would be enough. Cold weakened the body long before it killed it. It slowed movements, stole appetite, made small tasks exhausting. Over time, it left people vulnerable in ways they did not immediately recognize. Sickness followed. At first, it was ordinary illness, coughs, fevers, sore throats, children with runny noses, adults with aching joints, things people had lived with before. But winter changed everything. Cold made recovery difficult. Hunger slowed healing. Crowded rooms spread illness quickly. There was no way to isolate the sick without sacrificing warmth. Families lived pressed together, breathing the same air, sharing the same blankets. Illness moved quietly from one body to the next. Medical care was limited even in good times. During the long winter, it nearly vanished. Doctors could not travel easily. Snow blocked roads. Horses weakened. Some physicians were trapped in their own homes, tending to their own families. Most care happened inside the house. Women became nurses by necessity. They monitored fevers with touch. They counted breaths in the dark. They prepared what remedies they could from dwindling supplies. There were no antibiotics, no IV fluids, no oxygen, only rest, warmth, and hope. Warmth was the hardest to provide. Fever demanded heat, but fuel was scarce. Families faced impossible choices: burn more fuel to keep one person warm, or preserve it to keep everyone alive. Blankets were layered, clothes were worn to bed, bodies were placed close together to share heat. Sometimes this helped, sometimes it didn't. Children suffered most. Their smaller bodies lost heat faster. Their immune systems struggled under constant stress. A simple cough could turn serious in days. Parents watched closely for warning signs: labored breathing, lips turning pale, unusual stillness. There was little to do but wait. Adults pushed themselves beyond what they should have. They ignored pain and exhaustion because stopping meant surrender. Illness crept in slowly first, fatigue, then fever, then weakness. Many worked through it until they couldn't. In those moments, the household shifted. Children took on more responsibility. Neighbors stepped in when possible. Everyone adapted, quietly. Death was not sudden most of the time. It came slowly, after days or weeks of decline. Families marked time by breaths, by coughs, by nights survived. Grief was muted. There were no funerals as people imagined them. Frozen ground made burial nearly impossible. Bodies were kept in sheds, cellars, or unheated rooms, preserved by the cold until spring. This was accepted with a grim practicality. Winter demanded focus on the living. Some illnesses spread through entire communities. Influenza, pneumonia, diphtheria. Names were less important than symptoms. When one family fell ill, others watched anxiously, knowing they might be next. Schools closed, not as a health measure, but because teachers were sick or fuel was gone. Churches stopped meeting regularly. Gatherings became rare. Isolation deepened. Sound itself seemed to fade during illness. Houses grew quieter. Fires burned lower. Conversations dropped to whispers. Time lost meaning. Days blended together, marked only by storms and brief breaks in the wind. Care routines replaced schedules. Sleep came in fragments. Faith took many forms. Some prayed constantly. Others stopped altogether. Some found comfort in ritual, others in routine. Some in simply surviving one more night. No one judged how belief was used. The sick were not romanticized. Illness was messy, exhausting, and frightening. It tested patience and resolve. Children learned about mortality early. They learned that adults did not always have answers. They learned that love sometimes looked like helpless watching. Recovery, when it came, was slow. Weakness lingered. Coughs lasted for months. Bodies did not bounce back quickly. Malnutrition left lasting marks. But survival itself was an achievement. Every person who lived through illness became a fragile victory over winter. Some families lost more than one member. Others escaped with none. There was no fairness to it. People tried to find patterns: who stayed warmest, who ate better, who had stronger shelters, but many outcomes defied explanation. The prairie did not negotiate. Even after sickness passed, fear remained. A single cough could cause panic. A fever brought memories rushing back. People watched each other carefully. They learned to listen closely to breathing in the dark. Spring felt impossibly far away. Illness added a new layer to winter's burden. It took energy when none could be spared. It forced families to slow down when they needed to act. And yet, people endured. They endured long nights sitting beside the sick. They endured the smell of sickness in confined spaces. They endured the uncertainty of not knowing if morning would bring improvement or loss. There was no heroism in it, only persistence. By late winter, many communities were physically depleted. Faces were thinner, movements slower, voices softer, but life continued. Meals were still prepared. Fires were still coaxed from embers. Children were still tucked in at night, however cold the bed. Sickness had not defeated them. It had tested them deeply. And as winter dragged on, another truth became clear. Surviving the long winter was not about avoiding hardship. It was about absorbing it cold, hunger, sickness layer by layer, and still choosing to wake up the next day. The body could be weakened. The spirit could be strained. But as long as someone was there to tend the fire, to share warmth, to sit quietly through the night, winter had not yet won. Not completely. The animals were usually the first sign that things were getting worse. People could endure hunger. They could endure cold. They could even endure sickness for a while. But when livestock began to fail, the future itself started to shrink. Animals were not just property. They were heat, food, labor, and movement. They pulled plows, hauled water, provided milk, eggs, and meat. They turned isolation into something survivable. Winter took them methodically. At first, it looked manageable. Cattle lost weight. Chickens stopped laying. Horses grew thin but still stood. Families adjusted feed. They rationed hay. They tried to keep animals sheltered behind sod walls or in rough barns. But snow kept falling. Drifts buried grazing land completely. Hay ran out faster than expected. Feed that should have lasted months disappeared in weeks. Animals grew desperate. Cattle pawed at snow until their hooves bled. Horses chewed fence rails. Chickens froze on their perches. Storms made tending livestock dangerous. People risked frostbite just to reach barns. Some never made it back in time. Many animals died standing up. Cattle froze mid-step, their bodies stiffened by wind so severe it stripped heat faster than muscle could generate it. They were found later, half buried, shaped by snow. Horses collapsed from exhaustion and starvation. Once down, they rarely got back up. This loss was immediate and devastating. Without horses, families lost transportation. Without oxen, they lost plowing power for spring if spring ever came. Milk disappeared almost overnight. Children who relied on it grew weaker. Butter and cheese became memories. Eggs stopped entirely. Meat, once scarce but dependable, became a calculation. Families had to decide when to slaughter animals before starvation ruined them completely. Killing livestock early meant food now, but nothing later. Waiting too long meant losing everything. These decisions were heavy. Some families butchered animals indoors, doors shut tight against the cold. The work was slow and grim. Blood froze quickly. Hands went numb. Nothing was wasted. Hides were boiled for soup. Bones cracked for marrow. Fat was rendered into something barely usable. The smell lingered for days. There was grief in it, though people rarely spoke of it that way. Animals had personalities. Horses had names. Cows were known individually. Children noticed their absence immediately. Barns became quieter. The usual sound stamping hooves, lowing cattle, rustling straw faded away. Silence settled in their place. Livestock loss also changed how neighbors interacted. Borrowing animals was no longer possible. Everyone was short. Lending became dangerous. Some tried to pool animals together for warmth and feeding efficiency. It helped a little. Sometimes it failed completely. Predators grew bolder. Wolves and coyotes followed the smell of death. They circled homesteads at night, their howls cutting through the wind. People listened from inside, fires low, hoping the animals they had left would survive until morning. Animal deaths brought emotional exhaustion. Caring for animals had always structured the day. Morning feedings, evening checks, regular chores that marked time. Without them, days blurred further. People woke with fewer reasons to move. The loss also carried a future cost. Spring planting depended on surviving livestock. Fields could not be worked by hand alone. Families without animals faced another year of failure even if winter ended. Some realized, quietly, that staying might no longer be possible. But leaving in winter was impossible. So they stayed. They endured. Children learned early lessons. They saw animals suffer. They saw parents cry when they thought no one was watching. They learned that survival sometimes meant letting go. A few moments of dark humor surfaced. Oddly enough, people joked about animals being smarter for giving up early, about cows choosing a better place to lie down. It wasn't cruelty. It was pressure leaking out. Humor became another tool. By late winter, livestock numbers were decimated across the prairie. Whole herds were gone. Barns stood empty. What remained were bones, half buried in snow, marking where life had once been productive. When storms finally paused, the landscape told the story clearly. Dead animals dotted fields and draws. Fences lay broken. The land looked stripped, as if winter had taken inventory and kept most of it. Yet even here, survival showed itself. Some families managed to save one horse, one cow, a handful of chickens. These small victories mattered enormously. They represented continuity. They meant milk again someday. Fields plowed, wagons moving. Hope shrank to manageable size. Livestock loss hardened people. It forced acceptance of limits. It stripped away illusions about control. Nature was not impressed by effort. And still, people adapted. They shifted diets, changed plans, imagined new ways forward. Winter had taken the animals. It had not yet taken everything. As the season dragged on, attention turned inward to people themselves. Bodies weakened, minds frayed. The struggle became less about resources and more about endurance. The next challenge was not visible on the land. It lived inside the houses, inside the silence, inside the waiting. By late winter, sickness felt inevitable. Bodies were worn down by cold and hunger. Sleep came in short stretches. Every task took more effort than it should have. When illness arrived, there was no longer much resistance left. The problem was not just the sickness itself, it was the absence of help. Doctors existed, but they might as well have been on another continent. Snow blocked roads, blizzards erased landmarks. Horses were weak or dead. Even short journeys became dangerous. A doctor could not reach a patient, and patients could not reach a doctor. Medical care became whatever a family could manage on its own. People relied on what they already knew. Some had experience from earlier years. Others remembered advice from parents or neighbors. Most treatments were simple. Keep the patient warm. Encourage fluids if possible. Let them rest. Warmth was always the challenge. Fires burned low. Fuel was rationed. Families debated whether to use extra wood to keep a sick person warm or save it for the night ahead. These were not conversations people wanted to have. They were whispered, practical, and heavy. Illness spread easily in small cabins. There was no space to isolate anyone. One room held everyone. Coughs echoed off the walls. Air stayed thick. Children slept beside parents. Parents slept beside the sick. Everyone shared the same cold air. Respiratory illness was common. Coughs turned into pneumonia. Breathing became painful. Each breath sounded like work. Fever complicated things. Patients shivered violently, then burned hot, then shivered again. Families wrapped them in blankets and hoped for balance. There were no thermometers in many homes. Temperature was guessed by touch. Night was the hardest. Darkness magnified fear. Fires burned lower. The house cooled quickly. People listened to breathing in the quiet. Each cough sounded louder. Each pause between breaths felt longer. Some families took turns staying awake. One person slept while another watched. Fatigue piled up. Medicine, when available, was limited. Some had patent medicines bottles bought months earlier from traveling salesmen. Many contained alcohol or opiates. They dulled pain and fear more than illness. Home remedies filled the gaps. Herbal teas made from dried plants. Poultices applied to chests. Vinegar washes, mustard plasters. Prayer was common, but not dramatic. People prayed quietly. They prayed while working. They prayed without expectation. When illness turned severe, choices narrowed. Some patients recovered slowly, over weeks. Others declined suddenly. There was no clear pattern. Children were especially vulnerable. Parents tried to keep them fed, even when food was scarce. Sick children often received larger portions. Adults quietly ate less. Some parents went hungry so their children could have broth. Not all children survived. Death came quietly, often at night. Families discovered it at dawn, in the stillness before the fire was rebuilt. There was no panic, only grief and exhaustion. Bodies could not be buried easily. Frozen ground resisted shovels. Graves were shallow or delayed. Some families wrapped the dead and stored them outside, where the cold preserved them until spring. This was done without ceremony. Winter allowed no room for elaborate mourning. Adults suffered too. Men and women worked through illness until they collapsed. Stubbornness was common. Rest felt like surrender. Many paid for that choice. Frostbite infections became dangerous. Small cuts refused to heal. Fingers turned black. Pain lingered for months. Some people survived but were permanently changed. Stiff joints, weakened lungs, chronic pain. Survival came with costs. The absence of doctors also meant the absence of reassurance. No one could say, "This will pass." With authority, families made decisions in uncertainty. They treated symptoms and hoped. Neighbors helped when they could. Someone might walk miles through snow to check on a sick family. They brought broth, fuel, or just company. These visits were brief. Exposure was risky, but they mattered. Human presence mattered. When recovery came, it felt cautious. No one celebrated too early. A cough returning could undo everything. Survivors moved carefully. They conserved strength. They returned to chores slowly. The community changed as illness spread and passed. Faces grew thinner. Eyes seemed deeper. People spoke less, but life continued. Children played quietly when they had energy. Adults kept routines, however minimal. Fires were tended. Water was hauled. Meals were prepared. Illness did not break everyone. It bent them. The long winter demanded resilience in ways people had not expected. It tested knowledge, patience, and emotional endurance. There was no glory in surviving illness alone in a freezing cabin. Only relief. As winter dragged toward its end, families carried the memory of sickness with them. They knew how quickly health could vanish. They listened closely to bodies now. They moved with caution. And as snow continued to fall, another threat emerged. Not physical, but mental. The strain of waiting. The silence, the long stretch of time with no clear end. The next battle would be fought inside the mind. Children experienced the long winter differently. They did not have the language to explain it, but they felt it deeply. Cold was not a condition, it was a constant presence. Hunger was not dramatic, it was normal. For many children, winter became the shape of childhood itself. Days lost structure quickly. Schools closed early in the season. Some schoolhouses were too cold to use, others ran out of fuel, teachers stayed home, trapped or sick, lessons stopped. Children who had known routines suddenly had none. Instead, they learned by watching. They watched adults ration food, they watched fires shrink, they watched parents measure hope in small pieces. Work replaced play. Even young children were given tasks, carrying fuel, fetching snow to melt, watching younger siblings while adults worked or rested. These chores were not framed as responsibility, they were simply necessary. Children adapted quickly. They learned to move slowly to conserve energy. They learned not to complain when meals were small. They learned to recognize when adults were worried and when not to ask questions. Some grew quiet, others became restless. Play still happened, but it changed. Outdoor games were rare. Cold punished exposed skin too quickly. Most play happened indoors, in tight spaces. Games became quieter. Card games, storytelling, simple toys reused endlessly. Laughter was soft. Energy was conserved. Hunger shaped everything. Children noticed food disappearing long before adults admitted it. They noticed portions shrinking. They noticed adults skipping meals. Some children pretended not to be hungry to help their parents. Others asked constantly, unable to stop thinking about food. Both responses were understood. Nighttime was hardest. Beds were crowded. Blankets were thin. Cold crept in from walls and floors. Children learned to sleep fully clothed. Boots near the bed. Coats used as extra layers. They learned to fall asleep listening to the wind. Dreams were vivid. Some dreamed of warmth, others of summer fields, others of endless snow. Fear surfaced in unexpected ways. Children worried about small things, fires going out, animals dying, parents not waking up. They rarely voiced these fears directly. Instead, they asked simple questions. Is it morning yet? Are we warm enough? Will the snow stop? Parents answered carefully. They did not promise what they could not guarantee. Illness hit children hard. Small bodies struggled to recover. Fevers frightened parents. Coughs lingered. Children sensed adult fear immediately. They watched faces closely. Some children took on emotional roles beyond their years, comforting siblings, helping sick parents, staying quiet to reduce stress. This maturity came without praise. It was simply expected. Loss affected children deeply. When animals died, children mourned openly. Animals had been companions. Their absence was felt. When people died, children absorbed grief silently. Funerals were minimal or delayed. Explanations were simple and incomplete. Death became part of life, without ceremony. Memory formed under pressure. Children who survived the long winter carried it with them for life. Many later spoke of it as a turning point. They remembered hunger vividly. They remembered the sound of wind at night, the feeling of ice on blankets, the taste of thin broth. They also remembered small kindnesses, a shared piece of bread, a parent's hand on their head, a neighbor stopping by with fuel. These moments stood out sharply against hardship. Not all children survived. Mortality was higher among the young. This reality was understood but rarely discussed. Families grieved privately. Surviving children often felt this loss long after winter ended. Spring did not erase these memories. When warmth returned, children did not immediately trust it. They watched the sky carefully. They flinched at late snowfalls. Some became cautious adults, others grew stubborn. Many developed a quiet resilience that stayed with them. The long winter shaped a generation. It taught children that comfort was temporary, that security could disappear, that family mattered above all else. It also taught them adaptability. They learned to live with less, to adjust expectations, to endure. There was no celebration of this resilience. It simply existed. As winter dragged on, children became mirrors of their environment. Quiet, alert, they sensed that survival was ongoing, and as much as adults tried to shield them, children understood more than anyone wanted. They understood that winter had changed things permanently, that life after would not be the same. As the season neared its end, communities leaned heavily on their children, not for labor alone, but for hope. Children represented continuation. As long as they endured, the future still existed. The long winter tested adults in obvious ways, but it reshaped children silently. And when spring finally came, it would reveal not just who had survived, but who had grown up too fast. Before winter, frontier communities were loosely held together. Neighbors knew each other, but distance mattered. Homesteads were spread out. Help was available, but not immediate. Everyone lived mostly inside their own effort. The long winter changed that balance. Isolation made people more aware of one another. Survival stopped being entirely private. What happened on one homestead rippled outward. Community became unavoidable. At first, cooperation felt natural. Neighbors shared news when they could. They warned each other about storms. They traded supplies quietly, without keeping strict accounts. This was how frontier life was supposed to work. But winter kept going. As weeks turned into months, generosity became harder. Every shared resource reduced what remained at home. Every visit risked exposure to cold or illness. Helping others became a calculation, not a cruel one, a necessary one. Some communities organized early. They pooled what food they could. Churches opened their doors as shelters. Homes with better insulation took in neighbors who had none. These arrangements were informal. There were no rules, just agreement and necessity. Soup kitchens appeared in some towns, though the word kitchen often meant a single pot kept warm as long as fuel allowed. People brought what they could spare, a handful of flour, a bone, a few potatoes saved from seed stock. Meals were thin but shared. Sharing mattered as much as eating. It reminded people they were not alone. In other places, community support was quieter. A sack of cornmeal left on a doorstep, firewood stacked overnight, a note tucked under a door. No one announced these acts. Pride mattered. Accepting help was difficult. Giving it was sometimes easier than receiving it. Not everyone could help. Some families barely survived themselves. They withdrew, not from lack of care, but lack of capacity. This withdrawal was understood, but it still hurt. Silence could feel like abandonment, even when it wasn't. As winter dragged on, strain grew visible. People grew tired. Tempers shortened. Small disagreements lingered longer than they should have. Arguments broke out over shared resources, over borrowed tools, over boundaries crossed in desperation. These conflicts were usually brief, cold, discouraged, prolonged confrontation, but they left marks. Trust was tested. Some communities fractured slightly. Families focused inward. Cooperation narrowed to close neighbors or relatives. Others pulled closer together. There was no single pattern. Leadership emerged quietly. Not official leaders, just people others listened to. Often older settlers, sometimes clergy, sometimes women who organized care and supplies without calling attention to themselves. They made suggestions. They mediated disputes. They decided when to share and when to conserve. Their authority came from endurance, not position. Winter also changed social habits. Gatherings became rare, but more meaningful. When people did meet, they stayed close. They spoke softly. They shared news carefully. Stories were repeated often. Familiar tales offered comfort. Humor surfaced unexpectedly. Dark humor, mostly. People joked about the snow having intentions, about winter forgetting them, about living long enough to complain about it later. These jokes were not funny, exactly, but they helped. Community rituals adapted. Church services, when held, were shorter. Singing was quiet to save breath. Sermons focused on endurance, not reward. Faith became practical. Prayers asked for warmth, not miracles. When death occurred, communities responded with restraint. There were no grand funerals. People gathered briefly, if at all. The dead were honored quietly. Grief was collective, but subdued. There was no energy for public mourning. Children observed all of this. They watched adults navigate cooperation and conflict. They learned who could be trusted, who shared, who withdrew. These observations shaped future relationships. The long winter became a reference point. Years later, people would remember who helped and who did not. These memories lasted, but during winter, judgment was softened by survival. Most people understood that everyone was stretched thin. Help, when it came, mattered more than explanations. As isolation deepened, communication slowed. Mail had stopped long ago. News from outside was non-existent. Communities became their own worlds. Rumors circulated, some hopeful, some frightening. People learned to treat information cautiously. Hope itself had to be rationed. Too much hope led to disappointment. Too little led to despair. Communities balanced carefully. They marked time together. Storms became shared experiences. Each blizzard endured became a small, collective victory. People checked on each other afterward, counted survivors, counted losses. These rituals reinforced connection. By late winter, communities were thinner. Fewer animals, fewer people, less noise. But those who remained were deeply aware of one another. Survival had become communal. No one survived entirely alone. Even the most isolated families depended on others, indirectly on shared roads, shared knowledge, shared resilience. The long winter stripped away illusions of independence. It revealed how fragile self-sufficiency really was. And yet, it also revealed something else. People could endure together longer than they could alone. This endurance was not dramatic. It was built from small actions repeated endlessly. Sharing fuel, watching children, sitting quietly with someone who had lost hope. Community was not a cure. It did not stop the cold. It did not bring food. But it provided something just as important. Witness. To suffer alone was harder than to suffer together. Knowing someone else understood the weight of winter mattered. As the season edged toward its end, communities were altered. They were quieter, more cautious, more aware of limits. But they were also bound by shared experience. The long winter became part of communal identity. It would be spoken of later with restraint, often briefly, sometimes not at all. But it shaped how people understood each other, who stayed, who shared, who endured. Winter still held the land. Snow still covered everything. But within that frozen landscape, community had become one of the few remaining sources of warmth. Not enough to end suffering, enough to continue. The blizzards did not arrive all at once. They came in waves. Just when people thought the worst had passed, the wind returned. Snow followed. Visibility vanished. Each storm felt familiar, and yet each one found new ways to take something away. These were not gentle snowfalls. They were moving walls. Wind drove snow sideways, upward, everywhere at once. The ground disappeared. The sky disappeared. Distance became meaningless. People lost direction within steps of their own doors. Sound behaved strangely. Wind howled, then dropped into sudden silence, then roared again. Familiar noises vanished. Footsteps were swallowed. The world narrowed to what you could touch. Blizzards lasted for days, not hours, not overnight. Days of whitened noise and confinement. Families stayed indoors as much as possible. Fires were kept low, but constant. Doors were blocked with furniture. Windows disappeared behind snow. Inside, light dimmed. Snow packed against walls, cutting off what little daylight there was. Houses felt smaller. Air felt heavier. Time slowed. People slept more. Not from comfort, but from exhaustion and boredom. Waking hours stretched long and shapeless. Venturing outside was dangerous. Some had to try anyway. Animals needed checking. Snow had to be cleared to keep doors from sealing shut. Roofs threatened to collapse under weight. Each trip outside carried risk. People tied ropes around themselves, anchoring one end to the house. This was not overcautious. Without landmarks, even a few steps could become fatal. Stories spread quickly. Someone stepping outside to check the barn and never returning. Someone losing direction within sight of home. Bodies were sometimes found days later, frozen in crouched positions, faces turned away from the wind. These stories traveled quietly. They did not need embellishment. Children were warned repeatedly. Do not open the door alone. Do not wander. Do not chase sounds. Fear became instructional. Blizzards erased paths. Roads disappeared entirely. Fence lines vanished. Fields flattened into smooth white surfaces. After storms passed, people stepped outside and failed to recognize their landmarks were gone. Even experienced settlers felt disoriented. The prairie, already vast, became infinite. Storms also erased progress. Snow that had been cleared returned immediately. Drifts grew taller than fences. In some places, only chimney tops remained visible. People tunneled instead of shoveling. Paths were dug between house and barn, reinforced with boards where possible. These tunnels collapsed often. Everything required repetition. Blizzards affected the mind as much as the body. Whiteout conditions strained perception. Eyes ached from glare. Ears rang from wind. People grew irritable. Concentration slipped. Children became restless. Indoor confinement stretched patience thin. Movement was limited. Noise carried easily in small spaces. Adults snapped more quickly than usual, then apologized, then snapped again. No one felt fully like themselves. Nighttime during blizzards was especially heavy. Wind battered walls relentlessly. Snow hissed against windows. The house seemed under attack. Sleep came in fragments. People lay awake listening, counting gusts, waiting for the sound of something breaking. Some roofs failed under snow load, others held, but barely. Each morning after a storm brought assessment. Was the chimney clear? Was the door blocked? Was anyone missing? These questions became routine. Blizzards also cut off remaining connections between neighbors. Even nearby homes were unreachable. Shouts were lost. Signals failed. People endured storms alone, knowing others were doing the same, but unable to help. This isolation deepened psychological strain. Silence after storms felt unreal. Wind dropped suddenly. Snow stopped. The world held its breath. Sound returned slowly. A creaking roof, a shovel scraping, a distant voice, faint but real, emerging after a blizzard felt like stepping into a different world. Everything was altered. Snowdrifts reshaped the land. Familiar features were buried or transformed. The horizon looked closer. Movement remained slow. People worked carefully, conserving energy. No one rushed. Blizzards did not inspire panic anymore. They inspired resignation. Families prepared as best they could. Extra fuel near the fire. Food within reach. Water melted in advance. Then they waited. Waiting became a skill. The storms also marked time. People remembered winter not by dates, but by blizzards. The storm after Christmas, the one that buried the barn, the last big one before February ended. These references replaced calendars. Each blizzard survived, became a quiet milestone. The storms took lives. They took animals. They took strength. But they also clarified something important. The long winter was not a single event. It was a sequence of endurance tests. Each blizzard asked the same question. Can you hold on a little longer? By late winter, answers came slower, but they still came. People held on. They dug out. They rebuilt fires. They checked on neighbors when they could. The world outside remained erased, but inside, persistence continued. And somewhere beneath the snow, beneath the silence, spring waited, unseen, unpromised, but possible. Isolation was not new on the frontier. People expected distance. They understood silence. But the long winter transformed silence into something heavier. Mail had always been irregular. Trains were delayed often. Letters arrived late, sometimes weeks after they were written. During the winter of 1882-1881, they stopped entirely. Snow buried the tracks. Drifts blocked roads. Horses could not travel safely. Communication ended. Families still wrote letters. They wrote by firelight, fingers stiff with cold. They described conditions carefully, not wanting to worry relatives too much. Some softened the truth. Others wrote honestly. All of them waited. Letters piled up in homes, addressed but unsent. Some were folded and unfolded repeatedly. Others were sealed and placed carefully aside. Writing became a habit. It gave shape to days. It created the illusion of connection. People wrote to parents back east, to siblings, to friends who had chosen different paths. They described the snow, the cold, the shortages. They asked about news. They imagined responses. Children wrote letters to them. Some dictated them. Others scribbled short notes. They asked when spring would come. They asked if relatives were warm. These letters were precious and unanswered. Weeks passed, then months. The absence of mail became another weight. People wondered if relatives were alive, if anyone remembered them, if help might come. Rumors filled the gap. Someone heard the railroad would be cleared soon. Someone else heard that relief trains were being organized. Hope flickered, then faded. People learned to manage expectations. Waiting without information demanded restraint. Too much anticipation led to disappointment. Too little led to despair. Families balanced carefully. Isolation changed emotional rhythms. Conversations slowed. People spoke less. Silence grew comfortable, then heavy. Some found peace in it. Others felt it press in. Children asked questions adults could not answer. When will we hear from them? Do they know we're here? Are they worried? Parents answered with honesty shaped by necessity. We don't know. When the snow melts, they'll hear soon. These answers were enough for the moment. Loneliness manifested quietly. People missed familiar voices, missed laughter, missed the reassurance of outside perspective. Small worries grew larger in isolation. Without letters, there was no comparison. No reminder that life elsewhere continued. The world shrank. People became intensely focused on their immediate surroundings. The house, the family, the fire. Anything beyond felt abstract. Faith took new forms. Some wrote letters as prayers, never intending to send them. Others reread old correspondence until pages wore thin. Memories became anchors. People recalled summers, previous winters, journeys west. They reminded themselves why they came. The absence of letters also removed judgment. There were no expectations from outside, no opinions, no advice. This created a strange freedom. Families made decisions without external pressure. They adapted as they saw fit. Isolation forced self-reliance of a different kind, not physical, emotional. When mail finally resumed, reactions were mixed. Relief, yes, but also disorientation. Some people had changed too much to reconnect easily. Some letters arrived too late. News of births that had already happened, of deaths that had occurred months earlier. Time lagged painfully. But during winter, there was only waiting. Waiting became a discipline. People learned to endure uncertainty without resolution. They learned to sit with unanswered questions. This endurance was quiet. No one marked it, but it shaped people deeply. The long winter isolated families from the world, but it also forced them inward, into relationships, into memory, into self-reflection. Silence became a companion, sometimes comforting, sometimes unbearable. As winter stretched on, people learned that survival did not always mean action. Sometimes it meant patience. Sometimes it meant letting go of expectations. Letters would come when they came. Spring would come when it came. For now, there was only the present, the fire, the family, the waiting. And in that waiting, people discovered a different kind of strength. Not the strength to fight, the strength to endure without reassurance. Spring arrived cautiously, almost suspiciously. After months of unbroken cold, frozen ground, and endless snow, the first thaw was neither dramatic nor reassuring. It crept in. Subtle warmth touched windowsills. Snow softened in patches. The sun hung higher, though still weak. People noticed these changes cautiously, almost unwilling to believe them. After the long winter, optimism felt dangerous. One false sign of spring had the power to undo your composure entirely. The thaw did not feel like celebration. It felt strange, fragile. Movement returned, but slowly. People stepped outside and found the world unrecognizable. Snow had shifted, piled, melted, and refrozen. Drifts had collapsed. Barns were half buried, fences knocked down. Every landscape was new, almost alien. Animals that had survived winter emerged, thin and weak, coated in mud or clumps of ice. Some walked with a stiff gait, recovering from frozen hooves or months of malnutrition. Chickens that survived had stopped laying eggs for months, and eggs now returned unpredictably. Horses were leaner than anyone remembered. Cattle had thinned, their backs sharp under rough coats. Seeing them alive at all was a quiet relief. Families whispered greetings to their animals, as if they were old friends returning from a long absence. But spring also revealed loss. Dead animals buried beneath snow emerged. Hints of previous storms appeared in half-collapsed barns, broken fences, and flattened-out buildings. People walked fields that had once been grazing pastures, finding frozen carcasses or remnants of livestock they had long assumed were gone. It was shocking at first, a visceral reminder that winter had been absolute in its reach. Some buried what they could, others left remains for scavengers. Nobody lingered too long. There was work to do, and still little strength to spare. Water returned first. Melted snow pooled into streams, sometimes flooding low-lying land. Wells filled slowly, carrying a mix of ice, sediment, and long-dormant bacteria. People collected water carefully, fearing contamination, but grateful for anything liquid that didn't come from melted snow in a kettle. Walking outdoors became an ordeal in its own way. Mud replaced ice. Paths people had tunneled during winter were now impassable, sunk under soft, wet ground. Boots sank into it. Children laughed quietly when adults stumbled. Small victories, like avoiding a fall, felt important enough to be noticed. Work began again, but cautiously. Fields were still frozen beneath layers of snow and ice. Planting would have to wait. Livestock needed care fences repaired, stalls cleared, hay gathered. People worked slowly, conserving energy. After months of mere survival, the pace of ordinary chores was almost exhausting. Adults moved deliberately. Children helped where they could, carrying bundles of firewood or checking for broken fences. They were still thinner than they had been, still wary of exertion. The thaw had not restored vitality. It had merely returned possibility. Food was another challenge. Stored supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. Families calculated cautiously. Flour was mixed with bran or other fillers. Potatoes and root vegetables had survived in cellars, if insulated well. Meat came from surviving animals, though each portion was rationed carefully. Gardens were planted in small patches, only to be covered with snow again in sudden late frosts. The work was slow, the harvest uncertain, and people learned to temper expectations. The first thaw also revealed structural damage in homes. Roofs had partially collapsed under snow. Sod walls had shifted. Chimneys had cracked. People repaired what they could, using remnants of fuel and supplies scavenged from barns, fences, and abandoned properties. Many families lived with imperfect repairs for months, accepting drafts and leaks as part of the price of survival. Children helped where they could, carrying small boards or shoveling mud to stabilize walls. Every repair was a small victory, a reminder that endurance had not been for nothing. Illness lingered. Children who had recovered during winter were weak. Adults still felt the effects of frostbite, malnutrition, or illness that had never fully healed. Families dealt with lingering coughs, stiff joints, and slow-healing injuries. Hospitals and doctors were still far away or inaccessible. Survival, it seemed, came first. Recovery would have to wait. The thaw also brought the first real chance to see neighbors. Snowdrifts no longer blocked doors. Fences reappeared. Children could run short distances without fear. Adults could check on each other's livestock, share advice, and exchange small amounts of food or fuel. These visits were cautious. Everyone was aware that winter had taught lessons about scarcity and trust. Some shared freely, others guarded their remaining supplies. But even the quietest exchange reminded people that community still existed. Emotionally, the thaw was complicated. Relief mingled with exhaustion and trauma. Some families felt joy at seeing sunlight longer, at feeling earth under their feet, or at hearing the wind soften. Others remained cautious, unable to fully embrace warmth after months of cold. Nights were still long, and frost could return at any moment. People celebrated minimally, if at all, often with muted smiles or whispered acknowledgement of survival. The thaw was also a time for quiet reflection. People assessed what winter had taken: animals, food, buildings, and sometimes family members. Emotional scars were visible everywhere. Children more serious than their age should allow. Adults slower to speak, quieter in the presence of others. Families noted the gaps, the absences, the ruined dreams of a life untested by snow. Still, they survived. And survival, as they had learned, was enough to merit acknowledgement, even if only inwardly. Humor returned, slowly and in small doses. Children teased each other about slipping in mud. Adults exchanged dry jokes about snow that refused to leave. The absurdity of months of frozen monotony became a shared narrative, a way to process trauma without talking about it directly. Laughter was quiet, brief, but it mattered. It reminded people that the human mind could still adjust to relief, even if it came gently and without spectacle. By mid-thaw, routines began to shift. Fires burned shorter hours. Wells provided easier access to water. Paths could be cleared more efficiently. Families began to plan for spring planting and animal care. The work was slow, deliberate, and often exhausting, but now it was work aimed at renewal rather than survival. People moved with caution, still aware that the prairie could change quickly, and that warmth did not yet guarantee safety. The first thaw revealed permanence in loss. Some homes were abandoned forever. Families too weak or broken moved elsewhere. Fields that had been stripped of topsoil by wind and snow required months of repair. Animals lost to winter could not be replaced immediately. These tangible reminders reinforced the lesson that survival was not without consequence. Even when spring arrived, it was not an erasure of winter, it was a transition into something new, fragile and uncertain. And yet, the thaw marked a subtle shift in perspective. People looked at the land and understood that life could continue. Children dared to explore outside again. Adults dared to plan slightly further ahead. Community interactions increased. Conversations lengthened beyond essentials. People began to imagine the possibility of abundance, of planting crops, of restoring what had been lost. Spring was cautious, but its arrival was undeniable. By the end of the first thaw, the long winter had become part of memory. People remembered cold, hunger, illness, and isolation. They remembered the losses and small victories. They remembered the endurance that had allowed them to persist. And they understood, without celebrating, that life could move forward, but it would be changed forever. The first thaw was not triumph. It was not relief in a dramatic sense. It was observation, careful action, and cautious optimism. Snow melted slowly. Fires burned with more ease. People walked more freely. But they did so aware that winter had left an invisible mark on bodies, minds, and community. In that quiet transition, families learned a lasting truth. Survival is often quieter than we imagine. It is measured not in heroism, but in returning to work after exhaustion, in speaking to neighbors when speech is difficult, in tending animals after months of scarcity, in stepping outside into mud and slush and sun, and continuing. The thaw was not a celebration. It was a chance to continue living. And after the long winter, that was victory enough. By the deepest part of winter, hope was no longer the main fuel. Hope rose and fell too easily. It reacted to rumors, to breaks in the weather, to small improvements that rarely lasted. What remained was something steadier, routine. People continued, not because they believed things would get better, but because stopping felt worse. Each day began the same way. Someone woke before dawn, not because there was much to do, but because fires needed attention. Cold did not wait for convenience. Ashes were stirred. Embers coaxed back to life. Fuel was added carefully, measured by habit now. Others followed. Children woke slowly, bundled before leaving blankets. Adults stretched stiff joints, already tired before the day began. No one asked how long winter would last anymore. That question had been asked too many times. Instead, people asked smaller questions. Do we have enough fuel for today? Is anyone sick this morning? Can the fire last through the night? Survival narrowed its focus. Large plans disappeared. There was no thinking about next year, or expansion, or improvement. Those ideas belonged to another life. The goal was simple: get through today. Routine became discipline. Meals were prepared at the same times, even when small. Chores were done in the same order. Children were given structure, even when there was little to teach. Structure created a sense of control. It told people they were still acting, not just reacting. Parents understood this instinctively. They insisted on regularity for their children: bedtimes, chores, quiet hours. Not because it was efficient, but because it was stabilizing. Winter threatened to dissolve time into one endless stretch. Routine pushed back. Adults maintained habits even when they seemed pointless. Beds were made, tools were put away, clothes were mended. These acts did not change outcomes. They preserved identity. People needed to feel like themselves. The will to continue did not feel dramatic. It felt heavy. Some mornings, getting out of bed took everything. Muscles ached. Hunger lingered. Minds felt dull. But people rose anyway. They did not announce their determination. They did not frame it as bravery. They simply moved. Faith played a role, but not always in expected ways. Some people prayed less, not more. They had said everything already. Others prayed in fragments, short phrases, familiar words repeated until they lost meaning. Faith became background noise rather than guidance. For some, stubbornness replaced belief. They continued because they refused to be beaten by weather. This stubbornness was quiet. No speeches, no declarations, just refusal. Children absorbed this attitude. They learned that adults did not quit easily, that even when exhausted, responsibilities remained. This lesson stayed with them long after winter ended. Community expectations reinforced persistence. People noticed who kept going, not in a judgmental way, in a collective awareness. If others could continue, so could you. This was not comparison. It was solidarity. People checked on each other, even when they had little to offer. A knock at the door, a brief visit, a shared silence. These interactions mattered. They reminded people they were still part of something. The will to continue was also shaped by obligation. Parents endured for children. Children endured for parents. Spouses endured for each other. Leaving was not an option for most. Even when people imagined giving up, practical reality intervened. Where would they go? How would they get there? Staying was hard. Leaving was impossible, so they stayed. Some days were worse than others. Storms returned unexpectedly. Fuel ran dangerously low. Illness resurfaced. On those days, morale dipped sharply. People spoke less. They moved mechanically. They avoided eye contact, not from shame, but from exhaustion. Recovery from these low points was slow. Sometimes it came from small things: a day without wind, a meal that felt slightly larger, a laugh that surprised everyone. These moments did not restore hope fully. They restored function. That was enough. The long winter demanded emotional restraint. People learned not to imagine relief too vividly. They tempered expectations. Spring became an abstract concept, not a date. This restraint protected them. Too much anticipation had already caused pain. The will to continue became almost automatic. People no longer evaluated whether it was worth it. They had moved past that question. Survival was not debated, it was executed. As winter wore on, bodies adapted in small ways. People moved slower, conserved energy instinctively. They spoke less, gestured more. Calories were not wasted on unnecessary motion. Minds adapted to, emotions flattened. Joy and despair both softened. This emotional numbness was protective. It allowed people to function without constant stress. Later, many would describe this period as strange. They remembered events clearly, but not feelings. Winter had required emotional efficiency. The will to continue also came from memory. People remembered why they had come west. Land ownership, independence, opportunity. These ideas had been tested brutally, but they still mattered. Abandoning them meant accepting that sacrifice had been meaningless. This thought was unbearable, so people continued, not because they were confident, because they were invested. By late winter, continuation itself became the achievement. Each day survived added weight to the decision to stay. Turning back felt increasingly unlikely. The cost already paid was too high. People did not speak of this directly, but it influenced behavior. Effort increased as winter dragged on, not decreased. Giving up felt like wasting suffering. This logic was not healthy, but it was effective. The will to continue was not inspirational. It was exhausting. It demanded endurance without reward, but it carried people forward. As daylight slowly lengthened, barely noticeable at first, routine adjusted. Fires were lit slightly later. Children noticed the sun lingering longer. These changes were not celebrated. They were observed cautiously. No one wanted to believe too early. Winter had taught them that optimism could be dangerous, but something subtle shifted. The question changed. Not, will this end? But when it ends, what will remain? The will to continue had carried families through the worst, but it had also reshaped them. People were leaner, quieter, older, in ways that had nothing to do with years. They had learned limits, they had learned persistence, and they had learned that survival was not about strength alone. It was about showing up again and again, even when nothing seemed to change. Winter still held the land, but inside homes, something steady remained. Not hope, not courage, just the decision to keep going, one day at a time. By the time spring had truly arrived, families began to notice the full measure of what the long winter had taken. It was not always obvious at first. Relief arrived slowly, with melting snow and warmer air. People emerged from their cabins carefully. Still cautious, they looked at the land, the animals, and each other. They began to count not coins, not crops, but losses. Financial losses were often the most immediate. Crops had failed, either buried under drifts or destroyed by frost. Seeds meant for planting had been eaten or spoiled. Livestock that survived was weak and fewer in number. Tools had been damaged by cold or heavy snow. Fuel stores were depleted. Each family assessed what remained in the quiet aftermath, and for many, it was less than half of what they had entered the winter with. This counting was meticulous and deliberate. It could not be rushed. Families walked through barns, homes, and fields, noting what survived and what did not. They made lists in notebooks, scratched notes into walls, or memorized the losses in silence. Sometimes, neighbors came together to compare notes, not out of curiosity, but necessity. Shared information helped them plan recovery, even if it could not replace everything lost. Loss was not only material, emotional scars were everywhere. People noticed children who had grown quiet, older than their years. Adults moved differently, more slowly, more carefully, with a constant awareness of fragility. Families remembered deaths, both of people and animals, and the grief lingered in quiet moments. Children sometimes asked about lost pets or relatives, long after the snow had melted. Adults sometimes walked through empty fields, pausing where an animal had died or a neighbor had once lived, letting memory linger. Homes were permanently altered. Sod walls shifted, timber sagged, and roofs that had barely held collapsed in places. People repaired what they could, but gaps remained. Doors did not close properly. Floors were warped. Windows had cracked. Even small drafts reminded residents daily that winter had been absolute. Families learned to live with imperfections, sleeping with coats inside at night to stay warm, patching leaks with boards, or covering broken windows with canvas. These adjustments became permanent features, reminders that endurance comes with compromise. Health was another cost, both visible and hidden. Frostbite left fingers and toes stiff or misshapen. Illnesses lingered long after snow had gone. Some adults had weakened lungs from pneumonia or prolonged exposure to cold. Children who survived often grew more cautious and delicate, still recovering from hunger or sickness. Every cough or twinge of pain served as a reminder that survival had been earned, but not without consequence. Some families lost members entirely. These losses were permanent and undeniable. Funerals had been delayed or minimal during winter. Graves thawed only slowly, and burials took place under the shadow of exhaustion rather than ceremony. The absence of a loved one reshaped households. Tasks shifted, burdens multiplied, and quiet spaces once filled with voices remained empty. Grief became part of daily life, sometimes addressed openly, sometimes carried silently. Loss also existed in relationships. The long winter tested community bonds. Some neighbors had helped each other, forming quiet, enduring ties. Others withdrew, leaving families isolated even after snow melted. People remembered who had shared, who had abandoned, and who had endured. These memories affected interactions for years. Friendships shifted. Alliances were strengthened or weakened. The social fabric of frontier communities had been altered by months of extreme stress. Counting the cost revealed subtle, less tangible losses as well. Children had grown up faster than expected. Play had been constrained, and innocence had been tempered by necessity. Parents had endured emotional strain that left them quieter, more measured, and sometimes more rigid. People had learned to survive with less, but that survival came at the price of spontaneity, of comfort, and of freedom from fear. Not all losses were negative, though they were always costly. People learned endurance, patience, and caution. They understood limits better, both physical and emotional. Communities that survived intact emerged with deeper understanding of mutual dependence. Families who endured together often grew closer, their bonds reinforced by shared hardship. These gains were subtle. They were not celebrated. They were quietly acknowledged in gestures, routines, and small acts of care. Spring revealed unexpected casualties as well. Some homesteads were abandoned entirely. Families decided that the land, though claimed and worked, was too damaged to be worth continuing. They packed what they could carry and left, sometimes for neighboring towns, sometimes for settlements further east. Abandoning a claim carried shame and grief, but sometimes it was the only rational choice. For those who remained, neighbors who had left became absences in daily life, reminders of what winter had demanded. Counting the cost was not always linear. Some losses were immediate, others emerged slowly. Mudslides, floods from melting snow, and weakened structures caused additional damage. Hidden damage to livestock or crops became apparent only weeks later. Families adjusted as they observed these ongoing consequences. No one assumed that survival in winter meant security in spring. It did not. The long winter's effects persisted, quietly shaping daily life long after the snow had gone. Despite all losses, people also observed what remained. Children were alive. Families still had homes, even if imperfect. Communities, while altered, still existed. These observations did not bring joy or celebration. They brought perspective. Survival was not triumphant. It was real. It was measurable. And in that measurement, people found the basis to continue. Counting the cost became part of the rhythm of post-winter life. Families revisited fields, rebuilt fences, repaired barns, and planned spring planting. Work was cautious, measured by energy and remaining supplies. Decisions were guided by lessons learned during months of scarcity. Even small successes restored water lines, repaired roofs, or animals recovering strength were acknowledged quietly. People also counted the human costs in ways that could not be recorded in notebooks. They noted the silent glances of those who had endured more than they should. They watched how children moved and spoke, aware of the subtle imprint of hardship. They observed the weight carried in each adult's shoulders, the quiet endurance that had allowed families to survive. These counts were internal, intimate, and often unspoken. Communities assessed themselves too. Leaders emerged naturally, based on capability and trustworthiness during winter. Those who had helped others, who had remained steady under pressure, now guided rebuilding and recovery. Communities remembered both generosity and failure. These memories were practical. They shaped decisions about sharing resources, dividing labor, and supporting vulnerable families in the months ahead. Finally, counting the cost revealed the most profound truth. Survival had consequences that could not be undone. Every step, every rationed meal, every night spent in freezing cabins had altered the people who lived through the long winter. Even when spring returned, life could not fully return to what it had been before. And yet, This accounting also allowed quiet pride, not the kind shouted in town squares, but the kind acknowledged in small ways: a repaired fence, a child standing taller, a neighbor helping with a stubborn roof. These were reminders that despite loss, families had endured. Despite grief, they had survived. The long winter was remembered less for snow or cold, and more for the accumulation of consequences. Losses, yes, but also survival. Scarcity, yes, but also endurance. Hardship, yes, but also human resilience in its quietest, most disciplined form. Counting the cost was painful, it was humbling, it was necessary, and it was, in its way, grounding. It reminded people of what mattered: life, connection, routine, and the slow, patient process of carrying on, day by day. By the time fields thawed fully and water ran freely in streams, families understood the balance of loss and endurance. They had survived the unimaginable. They were weaker, scarred, and permanently altered, but still present, still functioning, still alive. And in that presence, in the quiet acknowledgement of what winter had taken and what they had retained, people began to imagine the next steps: repair, rebuilding, cautious hope. Life, after the long winter, was not the same. It was something harder, sharper, and more deliberate, but it was still life. Counting the cost was not over. It would continue for months, years, even generations. But the act of accounting, of facing reality, gave structure. It gave context to the endurance, and it gave meaning to the survival itself. And in the quiet prairie air, still faintly cold, people understood that survival was not about triumph. It was about persistence, continuation, presence, and that, after all, was enough. The long winter of 1882-1881 became part of frontier memory almost immediately. Not because people celebrated it, not because it was heroic. In fact, most survivors preferred not to talk about it at all. The memory was heavy, quiet, and sometimes painful. Stories were passed down in fragments. One family might remember the blizzard that buried their barn. Another remembered the night when a neighbor's chimney collapsed. Children learned these stories cautiously, hearing about survival without detail that could scare them too much. Over time, the tales became part of local legend, a collective awareness of what life could demand. Memory was selective. People remembered endurance more than suffering. They remembered how they persisted, not always how cold or hungry they had been. Certain events were exaggerated, others quietly omitted. Families did not want to relive months of frostbite, hunger, and isolation, so they focused on small victories instead. This selective remembering shaped frontier identity. The prairie, already vast and harsh, became a measure of resilience. Surviving the long winter became a quiet badge, a mark of endurance that did not require acknowledgement outside the family. People spoke little, but the shared experience was understood. Those who had been through it recognized each other instantly in ways outsiders could not. The long winter also shaped behavior for years to come. Families who had survived were cautious about preparing for winter. They hoarded more supplies. They reinforced homes. They planned for contingencies that might never arrive. This was not paranoia, it was prudence born of experience. Generations after descendants would notice the habits: extra firewood stacked, seed grain saved carefully, children instructed in tasks that seemed simple but ensured survival. All of this was a living memory, preserved in action rather than story. Yet, silence around suffering was also part of the memory. Deaths, near misses, and extreme deprivation were often unspoken. People did not dwell on them. They were acknowledged privately, quietly. Losses were recorded in hearts, not newspapers. Survivors carried them alone or within their families, shaping private grief into communal understanding without public dramatization. Over time, the long winter became romanticized in subtle ways. Stories emphasized resilience and resourcefulness. People remembered ingenuity more than fear. Humor resurfaced in tales of creative solutions, cooking odd mixtures to stave off hunger, shoveling snow tunnels, fashioning makeshift sleds. These stories were retold as lessons, lightly, almost jokingly, but always with the underlying acknowledgement of difficulty. The memory also reinforced identity on the prairie. People saw themselves as capable of enduring extremes that outsiders could not imagine. The long winter was less about cold and snow than about human persistence. Even those who had suffered losses recognized that the experience shaped them into something more self-aware, more careful, more capable. It was a lesson in limits and adaptation. Community memory, too, became selective. Neighborhoods and towns remembered who had shared supplies, who had helped repair roofs, who had carried water or food to others. Those memories influenced social bonds for years. Reputation was shaped not by wealth or eloquence, but by quiet endurance under extreme conditions. Acts that might have seemed small in normal times gained enormous weight after months of shared hardship. Children who survived remembered differently from adults. They remembered the small details that marked the extremity of winter: ice forming on blankets, wind whistling through walls, snowdrifts taller than themselves. They remembered the absence of friends who moved away or died, the silence, and the few moments of humor that kept them going. These impressions shaped their view of the world for life: careful, measured, aware of both fragility and possibility. The long winter was remembered as both a warning and a lesson. It demonstrated the consequences of underestimating nature, of relying too heavily on incomplete preparation. It reinforced the importance of community, foresight, and persistence. But it also showed that life could continue, even under conditions that seemed impossible. Survival itself became the most important story. Memory was often quiet, but it was persistent. Families revisited it during subsequent winters. They compared current conditions to those of 1880 to 1881, noting minor differences and similarities. They taught younger generations the practical lessons without exaggeration. Fires were built carefully, stores of fuel maintained, food rationed. Children learned to dress warmly, to monitor livestock, and to keep watch on neighbors. All lessons embedded in the lived experience of one winter. The long winter also shaped local culture. Festivals, church gatherings, and community work were sometimes timed or organized with the memory of scarcity in mind. People acknowledged that abundance was not guaranteed, and that cooperation, planning, and endurance were always necessary. Stories from the winter were woven into advice and instruction, forming a subtle cultural backbone for prairie life. And yet, for all its impact, the long winter remained quiet in its legacy. There were no monuments, no songs, no grand celebrations. Recognition came in the way people lived: through habits, through preparedness, through cautious optimism, and through respect for one another. The stories were passed down orally, carefully preserved in family lore, understood by those who had experienced them, and later by those who listened without judgment. Finally, the long winter was remembered because it demanded acknowledgement of limits. People learned humility in the face of nature. They recognized that survival was not about heroics, but about doing what was possible, every day, without fail. Endurance mattered more than victory. Routine mattered more than risk-taking. Life mattered more than pride. And in remembering, families preserved both their losses and their survival. They held on to what was lost: animals, food, homes, and loved ones. They carried with them the quiet weight of months, without contact, without certainty, and without relief. But they also held on to what remained: each other, routines that had kept them alive, and the understanding that human persistence could endure far beyond expectation. The long winter was not celebrated. It was not a story of triumph or spectacle. It was a story of survival, of endurance, and of the quiet strength that emerges when ordinary people are faced with extraordinary circumstances. Its memory shaped lives, guided decisions, and preserved lessons for generations. Families remembered because forgetting would have been more dangerous than enduring. Remembering kept them prepared, aware, and connected to a past that demanded both caution and respect. The prairie, once silent under snow, remained a witness to all of this. Every drift, every hollow, every frozen field carried echoes of what had occurred, and those echoes persisted in the lives of those who survived, shaping how they walked, how they spoke, and how they lived, not as stories for outsiders, but as truths held quietly, deeply, and with enduring care. In the end, the long winter was remembered because it mattered, not for glory, not for drama, not for triumph, but because it had tested life itself, and life had continued. The snow has gone now. Not quickly, not all at once. It melts slowly in the sun, dripping from eaves, pooling in depressions, turning fields into mud. The prairie looks different than it did before the winter began. Shapes are altered, fences are broken, trees lean under frozen weight. Everything carries the imprint of months of relentless cold and wind. And yet, life continues. Families move through this changed world cautiously, deliberately. They walk over softened ground. They check on animals. They repair roofs, patch walls, mend fences. Every action carries the memory of winter's grip. Every movement is measured, informed by endurance rather than convenience. Inside homes, The quiet strength of people who survived is visible everywhere. Chairs are patched, fires are carefully tended, meals are rationed, prepared with care, and shared deliberately. Children move with awareness. Adults are slower, measured, and watchful. These are not signs of weakness. They are signs of lives tempered by experience. The long winter left scars that cannot be seen. Bodies are thinner, joints stiffer, fingers marked by frostbite. Minds carry caution, memories of hunger, cold, and isolation. Emotions are tempered. Laughter returns, but slowly. People carry the weight of months in which survival was measured not in triumph, but in continued presence. And yet, the quiet strength is undeniable. It is in routine, in the act of waking each day, stoking fires, feeding animals, repairing what can be repaired, and continuing despite exhaustion. It is in the small gestures that make survival possible. Handing a cup of water to a child, covering a broken window with canvas, offering a neighbor a portion of food, listening to someone recount memories of the storm. These are ordinary acts, repeated countless times, and they become extraordinary when seen in the context of endurance. It is in perseverance without expectation. People survived not because of glory or recognition, but because they simply continued. They showed up for each other and for themselves, day after day, sometimes for months, without relief and without external acknowledgement. This is the kind of strength that history often overlooks, the ordinary courage of simply existing when the world has become unrecognizable. Nature continues, indifferent as ever. Wind rolls across the prairie. Birds return cautiously. The sun lingers a little longer each day. Water flows in newly formed streams. Animals graze in fields, thin but recovering. Life moves forward, and the long winter becomes part of the rhythm of the land, recorded in flattened grass, drifted snow, and repaired fences. Families emerge altered, but still whole. They are quieter, wiser, more deliberate. Decisions are made with care, informed by lessons learned under relentless cold. Children carry memories of months that demanded adult vigilance. Adults carry the weight of responsibility and endurance. Communities carry the awareness of mutual reliance and the fragile nature of survival. Humor returns in subtle ways. A child slips in mud and laughs. A neighbor jokes about the stubbornness of snow. An adult smiles at a melted patch of roof ice that threatens nothing now. These moments are brief, but they are real. They are proof that even after extreme hardship, human life carries the capacity for lightness, connection, and quiet joy. The prairie itself is both witness and participant. Empty fields, flattened fences, buried streams, and ice-scoured trees tell the story silently. The land does not celebrate survival. It does not acknowledge hardship. It simply exists. And in its quiet presence, people are reminded of their own place in the world. Small, vulnerable, but capable of endurance. The long winter, remembered in this way, teaches lessons beyond survival. It teaches caution, humility, and preparation. It teaches the limits of human strength and the importance of community. It teaches that life is fragile and that every day survived is a small, important victory. People reflect quietly on what has been lost. Animals, food, homes, even people they are remembered privately. Grief lingers, regret lingers, and yet, alongside these shadows, there is acknowledgement of what remains. Family, health, even if diminished. Home, even if altered. Community, even if changed. These remnants carry a quiet power, the reminder that survival is real, and that living through hardship is meaningful, even without glory. For those who endured, the long winter becomes part of identity. It is not something celebrated, but something carried inward. It informs how decisions are made, how resources are conserved, how children are raised, and how neighbors are treated. It is remembered not as a story of heroics, but as evidence of the human capacity to persist. Memory is selective. As always, people tell stories lightly, leaving out the worst nights, the most desperate moments. They recount the inventive ways they survived the tunnels dug through drifts, the odd mixtures cooked for sustenance, the small acts of kindness between neighbors. These stories are told quietly, without exaggeration. Humor and ingenuity emerge, but always tempered by the gravity of what winter demanded. The long winter also remains a marker of perspective. After it, ordinary hardships feel lighter. Minor inconveniences seem trivial. The capacity to endure becomes internalized. Families and communities carry an invisible measure of strength, built not on pride, but on quiet experience. They know now that life can be unimaginably harsh, and that ordinary persistence can carry a person through months of near impossible conditions. In the end, the quiet strength that remained is not something loud or visible. It is the subtle endurance woven into everyday life. It is in the way a parent keeps watch over a child. It is in the way a family shares a modest meal. It is in the way a community comes together without ceremony, without recognition, simply because they must. It is in the awareness that life, though altered, continues, and that surviving it is meaningful, even when unnoticed. As the sun warms the prairie and the first flowers push through thawing earth, survivors do not rush to celebrate. They move deliberately, cautiously, grateful for small comforts, aware of fragility. Snow will never dominate the land in the same way again, and yet its memory persists, embedded in structures, habits, and quiet awareness. The long winter teaches an enduring truth. Survival is not always dramatic. It is not always glorious. It is not always remembered in history books, but it is deeply human. Survival, endurance, and quiet courage, these are the things that remain. They are the true monuments of the long winter. And so, as the prairie winds continue to blow over grass and soil, warmed by spring, the people who survived move forward. They rebuild, repair, nurture, and care. They carry the memory of snow, of cold, of hunger, of isolation. And they carry, more importantly, the knowledge that the ordinary acts of endurance, the waking, the feeding, the tending, the continuing are enough to meet even the harshest of winters. This quiet strength, unseen by the wider world, forms the core of the frontier experience. It is uncalibrated, it is subtle, but it is real. It is human, and it endures. The long winter is over, the snow is gone, but the strength that carried families through it remains, quietly, permanently, and without fanfare. The long winter of 1880 was indeed just a season of snow and cold, which was a true test of endurance. Frontier families survived, not because life was easy, but because they adapted, shared what little they had, and refused to give up, even when the odds were stacked against them. It's hard to imagine facing months of isolation, hunger, and brutal weather, with nothing but grit and determination, but their stories remind us just how resilient people can be. If you enjoyed stepping into this frozen chapter of history, please give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. What part of frontier survival surprised you the most? And if you're in the mood for more calm, immersive history, be sure to check out the other videos on the channel. There are plenty more stories waiting, from everyday struggles to extraordinary survival. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next journey into the past.